Hello everyone, welcome to What's Missing. I'm your host, and today we'll be talking about a recent video from PragerU titled, What is Causing the Spike in COVID-19 Cases? Now, the reason I picked this video is to help explain just the type of arguments being used today when people try to deny the danger of COVID-19 to your children, or when they deny the importance of wearing a mask, and a whole bunch of other stuff we'll get into shortly. Before we start though, I'd like to emphasize that my mission here is to analyze the answers and explanations provided in this PragerU video. If you find that my argument could use some improvement, or maybe I got something wrong, feel free to leave a comment. I'm here to learn too. Anyway, let's get on with the video.
Let's do this. Do you want to explain what this is?
I will. So we've got a FDA authorized antibody test that tests for two things. Antibodies from the past, were you exposed to COVID-19 and are you now immune? Or current antibodies, is your body actively fighting off an infection? So that's IgG, memory antibodies, and IgM, current acute antibodies. So it's a finger stick test, and the results are in about 10 minutes.
I'm horrible at these needle things, anything like this, but I'll be fine.
This is a painless lancet. Oh my gosh. Close up of Will to see if he's crying.
I'm about to. That wasn't so bad.
Right? Only takes a little drop of blood. It's red, folks. It's red. Can you see that?
I do have red blood.
It's amazing. Draw a little blood.
And now people are coming in. You do this in like people's cars when they come to the.
Usually not the finger stick. So you hold that and put a little pressure on it. And now we get results in about 10 minutes. Actually, it's usually a lot quicker than that.
And it will tell me whether or not I have the antibodies.
It will tell us whether or not you have antibodies, either memory antibodies or acute antibodies, meaning that your body is currently fighting something off.
Okay.
So we'll set this here.
Okay, so I'll admit, I'm not sure which brand of test Mr. Barke is using here. He only mentioned that it's FDA approved and it tests for IgG and IgM antibodies. Based on the sources linked below, however, the majority of these tests are not typically used in the way Barke explains here. For one, he states that IgM testing is used for an acute ongoing infection, one that's still working its way through the body. Now, granted, IgM antibodies are produced very early on in an infection, and some IgM tests are more accurate than others. Regardless, Barke does not make that distinction here. He says that IgM testing in general will identify the presence of an ongoing infection, and this just isn't true. Antibody testing is generally considered less reliable than other types of tests when looking for the presence of an acute infection. What Barke should have recommended is the use of a viral genome test, which checks for the presence of viral DNA or RNA. It takes a long time for a person to produce antibodies of any kind, and even during an ongoing infection, there might not be enough IgM antibodies in your blood at that moment for the majority of antibody tests to notice. Thus, the result could prove unreliable, positive or negative. I'm just confused how Barke managed to make this mistake, generalizing IgM testing when there's a huge amount of variation between each brand. He's supposed to be a doctor. He should know better than this. But also, I'm surprised with him because of how easy it was to prove his blanket statement wrong. Even the instructions for one IgM and IgG antibody test, called ASSURE, clearly states this test is not intended for an acute ongoing infection. This is straight from the manufacturer, mind you. I'm not sharing an opinion here. It is a medical fact that most antibody tests are not intended to check for an ongoing infection. On top of that, and maybe he just misspoke here, but Barke states that IgG testing will detect a past infection, thus showing immunity. Now, I just want to clarify that getting COVID now may not prevent you from catching it again. Your body fought off an infection and created antibodies, sure, but the science behind COVID immunity is still really unclear. You may be immune from one strain of COVID, but there's multiple strains out there, and even then, who's to say the strain you encountered won't continue to change to the point your antibodies no longer protect you? I only mention this because I think it's irresponsible to make vague, generalizing statements about immunity, especially when we don't know for sure.
All right, we'll let that sit there for a few minutes and we'll find out.
Do I have like tape or anything? I just got to keep.
No, you just hold it for maybe a couple minutes and then you're good to just throw it away.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Well, I would shake your hand, but now I can't shake your hand. We have to do left hand.
Yeah, left-handed shake.
But I really appreciate you being here, Dr. Barke. Gavin Newsom in California just said now we're going to shut down the restaurants again in a lot of California counties. Is this a good move that they're trying to shut down the economy again?
You know, I think it's a terrible idea. We have to remember that initially when this virus came on, we were told we were going to shut down the economy temporarily, and the purpose of doing that was to so-called flatten the curve. And the idea was that we were worried about healthcare capacity, in particular New York, for a time in New Jersey, for a time even up in Seattle. The hospitals seemed to be overwhelmed by cases of COVID coming into the hospital. We're going to shut down the economy, let healthcare capacity come back online, then we would open up the economy. Well, that's happened. There's plenty of healthcare capacity now. We know a lot more about the virus, who gets it, how to treat it, who's at risk. So there's no reason to continue to shut down the economy.
Okay, so I don't know where Barke's getting his information, but my sources tell a very different story about this. For one thing, a recovery does not mean things won't slip back to the way it used to be. The situation has improved, but flare-ups across the nation could change that, and flare-ups become more likely when people make a lot of contact with each other. There's also research being done into how many people's lives were saved by shelter in place, which is looking to be about 350,000 people, almost 3 times the number that have died in the US. The situation may be looking up right now, but that doesn't mean it can't get a whole lot worse if we're not careful.
What a healthy society should do, and this is what we've done historically in the past, we should protect the most vulnerable, older folks, nursing home patients, extended care facilities, and those with significant pre-existing conditions. So we should protect them. Then folks that are sick, we should isolate or quarantine those people, but the rest of us, the young and the healthy, we should go about our business. There was never an expectation that we were going to prevent people from getting COVID-19. The deal was people would get the disease, but we want to mitigate the hospital problem, the hospitals being overwhelmed. There's plenty of capacity in the hospitals. What we're seeing now with increased cases doesn't mean increased hospitalizations. That doesn't mean increased deaths. We're seeing increased cases as expected. This is not a surprise. We shut down the economy, now we opened it up, so people are going about their businesses, back to restaurants, back to retail, back to shopping, and they're going to get exposed to the virus, and that's okay.
My last talking point covers this section pretty capably, I think. Barke's statement that it was never intended for people to catch COVID just isn't true. The data showing that shelter in place saved 350,000 people is a testament to that fact. Barke is entitled to his opinion, but it's bordering on blatant misinformation here, especially his point about protecting the vulnerable, even though he wants to reopen the economy. Flare-ups in Georgia, Texas, California, and many other states have shown that eased restrictions are going to lead to more cases, more deaths, and even more hospitalizations, not less. Like it or not, COVID-19 is an ICU illness. Even if it doesn't kill you, many people have experienced permanent nerve and lung damage. So no, catching COVID is not worth the risk.
We want to protect the most vulnerable. The other problem that we've seen is we've had massive protests across the United States and rioting. thousands of people in almost every single state, almost all of whom were in close proximity to each other. Many of them were not wearing masks. So of course, a few weeks after these protests, we're going to see a spike in cases. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. The problem with the spike in cases is not from restaurants that are all social distancing. Almost all of those restaurants now are requiring masks. The problem is not retail outlets that also require social distancing. The problem was massive groups of people throughout the country not socially distancing, exposing themselves. Now, the good news is, as I watch those videos, you don't see too many 65-year-old or older in these protests. It's almost young people like you. So the average age right now of the new cases that we're seeing is about 31 years old. Those are the folks that have an easy time with this virus. As a matter of fact, it's almost hard to calculate the fatality rate of people that are young that get this virus. There's so many zeros after the decimal point that it's hard to calculate.
All right, so I'm repeating myself again, but as my sources show, ending shelter in place was a horrible idea. That another 350,000 people would have died if shelter in place had not taken effect when it did. So no, reopening the economy without restriction is not a safe decision. But surely the protesters should take a little responsibility, right? I mean, gathering in crowds isn't a terribly smart idea when a pandemic is going on. So why should the protests get to continue while the economy stays closed? Well, contrary to what Barke says here, the evidence indicates that the protests did not cause a significant spike in COVID cases. Some people were infected, sure, but there is no evidence to support Barke's protest-induced flare-up theory. This is according to the evidence, mind you, not politics, and it concerns me that Barke is so willing to deny this reality even though he's supposed to be a doctor. He states that the current age of infection is about 31 years old, as if this is supposed to prove that the protesters are responsible. This piece of information doesn't really tell us anything. Instead of relying on the evidence, Barke has chosen to make an assumption that may sound convincing, but lacks any proof.